So this is my Gwendlyn di Corci Commander deck, and this is a deck I built when I realized that I tend to focus mostly on monocolored and bicolor decks, and I don't really venture into three-color decks very often. So I wanted to give a Grixis deck a try. And I settled on a discard and draw Punisher deck. So the theme of the deck is to use stuff like Underworld Dreams and Liliana's Caress to deal damage every time my opponents draw or discard a card. Now the problem with this is that it sort of implies that you're going to be building around hand disruption, and most people don't like having their hands blown away. I've played against some pretty nasty Nath of the Guiltleaf decks, and they're not really fun to play against because, it's more fun to play the game when you have cards in your hand. So I decided to work with these Punisher cards by using wheel effects. Stuff like Wheel of Fortune to make my opponents draw lots of cards and discard lots of cards. So they're not really losing their hand, they're just getting a bunch of new cards. And the reason that I think these are very effective is because it sort of maximizes the amount of drawing and discarding that I get around the table. So, for instance, if I have Liliana's Caress and Underworld Dreams out, then I'm getting a ton of damage off of one Wheel of Fortune. Whereas, say, a Mind Twist, for example, is only going to hit one player, and it'll only really deal some damage if they have some cards in their hand. So people are still going to have fun because, I'm letting them draw lots of cards, but they're going to take a lot of damage. The point of this deck is to sort of blow away my opponents pretty quickly with a big Wheel of Fortune or Memory Jar or something, and basically I'm spreading the love because everyone's taking a lot of damage at once. It's a fairly casual deck, actually. I really tried to avoid running too many staples because, when you have access to blue and black, you run the risk of, running all of the broken tutors and spot removal and counter spells, and I tried not to do that, but I can't resist running just a few counter spells. So I'll show you what this deck is like. It runs kind of like a combo deck with a bit of control mixed in. So it's definitely a fun deck if you're looking for a not too broken Grixis deck. So first I'll take a look at the general. I settled on Gwendlyn di Corci. So for 4 mana in Grixis colors, we get a 3/5, and she can tap to make a player discard a card at random. So the first thing I'll talk about is the colors she gives us access to. So Grixis is some pretty fantastic cards. Blue obviously gives us access to counter spells, lots of card draw, and utility spells like Cryptic Command. Black gives us the best tutors, and red gives us access to some wheel effects, some good spot removal, all sorts of goodies. So these colors are pretty essential if you want to build this kind of deck. There are a couple other discard-themed generals you could choose from. Crosis the Purger is a big fat dragon who can destroy people's hands, as well as Nicol Bolas. The reason I wasn't crazy about either of those is that they kind of cost a lot of mana, and they're going to draw a lot of hate, and your opponents are going to, see them coming from a long way away. So as soon as you hit 8 mana, they're going to make sure they have their Path to Exile open. You're probably never going to connect with your Nicol Bolas general. So I'd rather run a general who's a bit more unassuming, not going to draw much hate, and she's actually going to provide me with a bit of board presence. This deck does not run too many creatures, so it's going to draw a lot of early game attackers, but it helps to have a 5 toughness blocker on my side of the field. It's also nice that she's not crucial to the success of the deck. Obviously she's nice to have out, but she's not going to make or break the game if she keeps getting killed. So because of this, you can really run any Grixis color general for a deck like this. Maybe like Thraxamundar or something as a nice plan B. I like Gwendlyn because she's pretty badass. She's like this, I don't know, elf thingy. Anyways, for some reason she's a 3/5, which doesn't really make sense, but she's cool. She's an old Legends general, so I like her. So the makeup of the deck is pretty straightforward. We've got a bunch of cards that make our opponents draw and discard lots. I'm mostly focusing on wheel effects because, like I said earlier, they provide the maximum amount of drawing and discarding for my opponents. Usually they target everybody, and they cause a whole lot of hand shuffling around, so you're going to do a lot of damage with your Punisher spells. And then we've got all of these Punisher effects, which hurt my opponents for drawing or discarding too many cards. So it plays a lot like a combo deck. You're just going to want to combine one of these with one of these, and you're going to generate huge amounts of damage, huge amounts of card advantage, hopefully both. And then we've just got our support spells, so spot removal, a few counters, lots of tutors, mana rocks, etc. So I'll start with the wheel effects of the deck. The reason I wanted to focus on wheels, like I said, it's a little more fun for my opponents when I'm letting them draw a bunch of cards as well as making them discard cards, because at least they have something to play with. But also wheels are just far more effective in that they cause such a huge amount of drawing and discarding that you actually get your Punisher spells to reach their maximum potential. Also, I find that if you're focusing on stuff like Mind Twist and, Cabal Conditioning and whatever, your opponents get sort of immune to your Punishers once they run out of cards in hand. Like, they can't lose any life to Megrim if they don't have any cards in their hand to discard. So wheels force your opponents to draw cards, and then you can make them discard those. So you're never going to run the risk of your opponents being protected just by running out of their cards in hand. So start off with Wheel of Fortune, a pretty obvious choice. All players discard and draw 7 new cards. This is good for you because you get to draw 7 more, and hopefully you'll hit some more wheel effects. Wheel and Deal is obviously not as good because you don't get to target yourself with the effect. But as far as punishing your opponents, it's just as good because you're making them draw a new hand of 7. Then we've got Windfall and Jace's Archivist. Yeah, these ones are pretty similar to Wheel of Fortune. Jace's Archivist is obviously reusable, but you lose the element of surprise because you can't tap them right away. So yeah, all of these effects are pretty similar. A couple more Wheel of Fortune-like effects. We have Memory Jar and Magus of the Jar. Memory Jar is actually probably the best card for this deck because it actually guarantees that your opponents will be drawing 7 cards and probably discarding 7 cards. So, with Wheel of Fortune, there's no guarantee that you'll get any triggers off of Megrim because they might not have any cards in hand. And, yeah, Memory Jar is one way to guarantee that you're going to get the maximum potential out of your Punisher spells. So, this is really good. You can use it the turn it comes out. Even if you can't, benefit in that you actually get to cast the stuff you get, you'll at least get a lot of triggers off of your Punisher spells. Magus of the Jar, obviously not as good because it has to wait around for a turn, but obviously it's just as potent when you pull it off. Next we have some smaller scale Wheel of Fortune effects. Incendiary Command and Chandra Blaze, pretty similar. Incendiary Command, pretty much the worst command in the cycle, but it has a home in this deck, mostly because each player discards all the cards in their hand and then draws that many cards. So not as good as Wheel of Fortune in that, once again, if they have nothing in hand, then they're sort of protected from this. But it's good enough, mostly because it has those other handy abilities, especially 2 damage to each creature. That's going to blow away a lot of utility generals and some annoying utility creatures. And it's always nice to be able to destroy a non-basic land. So the utility makes up for the not-so-great wheel effect. Same with Chandra Blaze. She's got that middle ability, which is the most important thing on her. Each player discards his or her hand and then draws 3 cards. And then some handy spot removal and a potential ultimate, which I'll probably never use. But she's decent. Both of these cards are mostly useful for their utility and the fact that they can wheel if I have nothing else to choose from. And then Urza's Guilt. This is just sort of a small-scale wheel effect that also does some damage. They actually have a net loss in cards in hand, which is pretty handy. Of course, it also affects me, but overall this card is pretty solid. Next we have a series of creatures who cause wheels when they deal damage. Shocker, 1/1 for 2, and whenever he hits someone, they have to discard their hand and draw that many cards. So he's going to guarantee quite a bit of discarding and drawing for your Punisher effects. Barbed Shocker is the same. The haste makes him very useful because they're not going to have a blocker set up usually. And then Dragon Mage, he's a big fatty, 5/5 for 7 flyer, and then when he hits something, he does a full-on wheel. Everyone discards their hand and draws 7 cards. So he's pretty nasty if I get him going. Then lastly, we've got sort of a random bunch of cards here. Anvil of Bogarden just does a lot for only 2 mana. So people skip their discard phases, they draw an extra card, and then they discard cards. So this causes a lot of triggers for my Punisher effects. So it's just a handy little thing to have out. Ill-Gotten Gains is very interesting. So for 4 mana, you force everyone to discard their cards and then return 3 cards from their graveyard to their hand. So this is a mass discard for only 4 mana, so you're going to get lots of triggers off of your Megrims. But it's also cool because it's the only way this deck can actually recur stuff from its graveyard. So I don't have access to green, which means I don't have regrowth or whatever. And because my deck is so reliant on Liliana's Caress or Underworld Dreams, they're usually targeted by spot removal, and this is one way I can get those back. Obviously, it's not optimal to let my opponents choose their 3 best cards in their graveyard, but hopefully Ill-Gotten Gains will fetch a Wheel of Fortune, and I can immediately make them discard those cards again. So this is a very interesting card that I like a lot in this deck. Syphon Mind. I'm actually not a fan of this card. I don't like running cards that are only good in multiplayer, and this card definitely fits that description, because I like to play my decks in single player as well. But it's just so on theme, and it's a huge advantage. Myojin of Night's Reach. I did say before I'm not relying on Mind Twist type effects where people just lose their hands, but this card is just too good not to use. So I'm kind of a douche for running this, but whatever, it's on theme. Same with Nicol Bolas. He's just cool. So he's a big fat dragon that makes someone discard their hand whenever he hits you. So now we'll move on to the Punisher effects in the deck. So I'm running cards that punish for drawing and for discarding. So I'll start with the ones that punish opponents for drawing. Underworld Dreams is obviously a classic. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they take 1 damage. We've got Spiteful Visions. You get a bit more fun with this card because you're forcing everyone to draw extra cards. However, this one affects you as well. I'm okay with the cards that hurt me as well because, you know, I've got enough ways that only hurt my opponents that I'm going to win the race anyways. So I'm okay with taking a bit of damage off of this. Same with Phyrexian Tyranny. This hurts me as well. This is an interesting enchantment from Plane Shift. Whenever a player draws a card, they have to lose 2 life unless he or she pays 2. This actually does a bucket load of damage. Underworld Dreams, Spiteful Visions, Kederekt Parasite, they only do 1 damage when your opponent draws, but this does 2. And if you can drop this and catch them off guard with a Wheel of Fortune right away, they're probably not going to have any mana up to pay that 2, and so they're going to take 14 damage right off the bat. This thing's pretty nasty. Obviously it hurts me as well, but it's a lot better than it looks. The ability to pay 2 to prevent the damage is really not that big a deal, so this is a really good card in this deck. And then Kederekt Parasite, his ability is just Underworld Dreams if you have a red permanent out. Hopefully I'll get him out with Gwendlyn, because I don't really have a ton of red permanents in the deck. Consecrated Sphinx, just a busted card, which I justify running because it's obviously on theme. Yeah, if I drop a Wheel of Fortune with this thing out, then I'm going to town for sure. And Plagiarize. This is just a really fun card in this deck. So yeah, until end of turn, if target player would draw a card, instead that player skips that draw and you draw a card. So obviously this combos with any of my wheel effects. Shocker, Wheel of Fortune, Memory Jar, whatever. Basically, I'm just going to make them discard their hand permanently, and I get to draw cards instead of them. It's pretty mean, and it's kind of hard to pull it off because you need 4 extra mana on top of your wheel mana, but when you do pull it off, it's pretty nasty. I like this one a lot. And now we've got a few cards that hurt my opponents when I draw cards. Because I'm usually affected by the wheel effects as well, these generally work just as well as the Underworld Dreams type effects. So we've got Psychosis Crawler. Whenever I draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life, so that hits all my opponents. So this thing does quite a lot of damage after a Wheel of Fortune. It's going to hit everyone for 7. And of course his power makes him a pretty beefy creature to have on the field. 5 mana is expensive, especially if you don't have any cards in hand and he's just going to die immediately, but he's pretty nasty. Niv-Mizzet, whenever I draw a card, deals 1 damage to target creature or player, so he can only hit 1 person at a time, but that's still pretty good. Usually I want to focus fire 1 player down anyways, and he's card advantage just because you can tap him to draw cards and nuke creatures. So unlike Psychosis Crawler, he can kill off creatures on the board. And then Words of War. This is kind of an interesting card in this deck. Haven't had a chance to play with this more than once. When I did get it down, it was really nasty. Basically, it lets me skip card draws to nuke players or creatures. And because Wheel of Fortunes are making me draw all kinds of cards, I can use this to finish someone off, pay a bunch of mana, take 14, I'll skip my draws, but you're dead. Or I can just use this to kill off annoying creatures. So, this is a really nasty card in this deck. Obviously a bit situational, but it's going to really dominate once it's out. Now on to the effects that punish my opponents for discarding cards. These 2 right here, obviously the inspiration for the deck. Megrim Liliana's Caress. Whenever an opponent discards a card, they lose 2 life. So that's quite a lot of damage to take from a Wheel of Fortune. If they've got a full grip, that's 14 damage right there. These are pretty crucial to the success of the deck, and usually I'm going to try and tutor these up and keep them in play immediately. So these are my main win condition. Of course I have many other effects to kill off my opponents, but this will usually be my quickest route to victory. Bloodchief Ascension. This thing's going to require some quest counters, but It's pretty easy for people to take 2 damage a turn in Commander, especially with Megrim or something out. They might just take it from a shock land or whatever, someone will attack someone else. But once I get this up to 3 quest counters, then this is pretty lethal. Life gain and extra damage whenever they discard, or whenever anything goes to their graveyard. So if I can get this online, it's pretty deadly. And then one of the nastiest cards in the deck for sure, Geth's Grimoire. Whenever an opponent discards a card, you may draw a card. So that's absolutely nasty with the Wheel of Fortune. I can dig 20 cards deep in a turn, and then find whatever nasty card I need to finish everyone off. Probably another Wheel of Fortune or something. So this is definitely one of the nastiest cards I can have out, and it's usually going to win the game if it stays out for just a couple turns. Next we've got some creatures that benefit from my opponents discarding lots of cards. Abyssal Nocturnus is one of the nastiest win conditions in this deck. Whenever an opponent discards a card, +2/+2 in Fear. So off Wheel of Fortune, he instantly becomes deadly and probably unblockable. He can just one-shot people usually after a Memory Jar or something. So he's pretty deadly. I guess Memory Jar wouldn't work because they don't discard it until end of turn. But anyways, really, really good creature. Sangromaner. I was sort of unsure about this thing at first. All it really does to punish people discarding is gaining me life. But really, if people are discarding entire hands off of a wheel, then I'm gaining a lot of life. And there's nothing wrong with having a lot of life in Commander. Especially if you're the target and people are trying to kill you off quickly, this can easily put your life total out of reach. So I like this, just to give me a bit of protection. And then Guiltfeeder. Obviously this doesn't directly punish players for discarding, but you can bet that after lots of Wheel of Fortune and Memory Jar type effects, everyone on the board is going to have a pretty full graveyard. So like the Abyssal Nocturnus, he's going to be pretty hard to block, and he's a pretty good plan B. He's going to deal quite a lot of damage, possibly one-shotting people later in the game. So I like this guy. And then we've got just 2 more cards which generally punish my opponents just for taking damage. Sygg River Cutthroat is just a nice card advantage engine. People are losing life for all kinds of reasons in this format. Usually to my Megrim, but also, just shock lands, fetch lands, attacking each other. I'm going to draw quite a bit of cards off of Sygg. So he's just a sort of on-theme card that I like to have in this deck. Wound Reflection is absolutely nasty. Basically, everyone takes double the amount of damage they normally would take, and this is just deadly with, one of my Megrim effects, plus Wheel of Fortune. I'm looking at one-shotting every player on the table once I have this out. Definitely a target once I get it out. It's absolutely deadly. So next I'll take a look at the utility. I really wanted to avoid stuffing too many staples in this deck because it would have been really easy to do that in these colors. However, given how dependent I am on stuff like Megrim and then Memory Jar, I really couldn't skimp on the tutors. So being in black, we fortunately have access to quite a few. I don't need to say a whole lot about Vampiric and Demonic Tutor. These are obviously incredibly good. Beseech the Queen is pretty solid. I hate having to reveal the card, but it's still going to get the job done. Demonic Tutor, Increasing Ambition, a new card from Dark Ascension. One of the nastiest tutors to be printed, in my opinion. Costs a lot, but it can single-handedly tutor up a combo for the flashback. And when I'm casting a lot of Wheel of Fortunes, anything with flashback is obviously appreciated. Mystical Tutor, usually going to grab a utility spot removal or a Wheel of Fortune effect. And Sensei's Divine Top. Obviously not a tutor, but a staple card to have for fixing your draws in any deck. Moving on to my spot removal, Grixis colors have access to some fantastic utility removal, so I didn't skimp on that. Terminate, just straight up destroy any creature for 2 mana, pretty reliable at instant speed. Pongify is a card which is finally starting to get some attention in Commander. I don't think it was hugely popular a few years ago, and I admit it took me a while to realize how good this card was. While big flashy effects are fun and all in Commander, stuff like utility removal really needs to be cheap and reliable. So at 1 mana, destroying any creature makes this very cheap and reliable. The 3/3 Ape isn't that big of a deal, so really this is just Blue's version of Path to Exile or Swords to Plowshares. So it really is incredibly good, and I'm starting to run it in all of my blue decks. Ashes to Ashes is just a favorite of mine, because it's a 2-for-1, and it exiles the creature, and it doesn't matter if the creature is black. So yeah, really good 2-for-1 in black. Aftershock, just a really good Vindicate in red. Destroying artifacts is really important. I don't have a ton of ways to do that with my blue or black colors, so I need to rely on my red to deal with artifacts. Same with Crosis' Charm. It seems pretty similar to Aftershock. It can deal with artifacts or creatures, or if all else fails, it can bounce any permanent. So it seems pretty good, and it's at instant speed. Nicol Bolas Planeswalker. So he's basically just repeated spell removal in this deck. He can deal with non-creature permanents or creatures one way or another. If he's on the battlefield, he's going to draw a lot of hate. So he's just really fun. I like to play with him because I have access to him in these colors. And next I've got a few sweepers. I forewent the Damnation, Oblivion Stone, Nevinyrral's Disc staples that you usually want to run. Because I'm doing slow incremental damage to all of my opponents at once, I figured that Earthquake effects were going to be a little better because I can use these to sweep away creatures or to finish off my opponents. So the classic Earthquake is good. Comet Storm, I sort of wish this were a fault line if I could get my hands on one. It's basically an Earthquake at instant speed. Comet Storm is pretty good though. Multi-kicker means I can just target any amount of creatures if I have the mana open. There's also a card from Portal 3 Kingdoms called Rolling Earthquakes, which hits all creatures except creatures with horsemanship. So obviously that's way better than Earthquake, but I think that's like a $200 card or something. And then Decree of Pain, not an Earthquake effect, but it's just way too good to pass up. Massive card advantage for only 8 mana. And then lastly we have a small selection of counterspells. I originally built this deck with no counter magic, but found that I, went through withdrawal, not having access to my lovely counterspells. I think 4 is an absolute bare minimum that I can get away with. This is just here to protect my Megrim effects, which are so commonly targeted. I need to have some way to protect them. So I'm focusing on cheap counterspells with some utility. Arcane Denial is just awesome for 2 mana, and it even forces my opponent to draw some extra cards. So maybe they'll do that with my Underworld Dreams out. Counterspell, counter target spell for 2. Forbid, the buyback is pretty ruthless in this deck. And Cryptic Command is just my favorite card, so not much to say about that. And then a small selection of mana rocks. This is not a very mana-hungry deck. I really only need to get up to 8 mana to cast my most expensive spells. I think if I had access to them, I'd throw in a few more mana rock staples. But we've got Sol Ring, Coalition Relic, and Gilded Lotus, both very good because I have a lot of color-hungry spells in this deck. And then Thran Dynamo is just a really efficient one. So 4 mana and it'll tap for 3 colorless. Alright, so next we'll take a look at the mana base. I'm running 40 lands, which is probably the bare minimum if you're only running 4 mana rocks like I am. I had to sort of borrow cards from other decks to make a presentable mana base. Really, I don't have extras of a lot of these. But this is as close to optimal as I could get. So the most important thing you need for a 3-color deck is a dual land package plus fetch lands. So we've got the Ravnica Shock lands and 5 fetch lands. Probably going to want to run more than 5 of these if you have them. They're just really good. So basically any of these fetch lands will give you access to any of your shock lands, so that you'll have pretty optimal fixing right there. So that's the start of any really good mana base for a 3-color deck. And then after that, the filter lands are absolutely fantastic. This deck has a lot of tricky mana costs, like triple black, triple blue, so it's really handy to be able to fix up your mana with these things. Then after that, there's a few ways you could go. I'm a big fan of the Pain lands, just because they're reliable. They don't come into play tapped. I really hate having too many come into play tap lands. Like the Vivid lands are, cheap, easy to come by, but you're really going to hinder yourself if you're doing everything a turn later than you want to, because all of your lands come into play tapped. I've got the M10 lands, don't always come into play tapped, but sometimes they do. They're okay. I don't think I would run them in an optimal list, but I don't have the original duels for this deck, so they'll do, I guess. I'm running the Man lands from Worldwake. Not that great, because they always come into play tapped. I really like Creeping Tar Pit just because it sneaks in the last bit of damage. Usually this deck can sometimes run out of gas late in the game if someone finally deals with Megrim, but this is one way I can sneak in the last few points of damage while avoiding sorcery speed wrath effects. And we've got a whole bunch of lands that can tap for all 3 of my colors. So City of Brass and Reflecting Pool are both very good. Grand Coliseum's okay, not that great. And then obviously Command Tower is perfect. Crumbling Necropolis, pretty good. We've got a few utility lands. Because we really just want to focus on casting our spells reliably and effectively, you know, you don't want to make room for too many utility lands. But Pajuka Bog is obviously just way too good to pass up. Urborg makes sure I get my Underworld Dreams out. Minamo, why not? I have a general with a tap ability, so this is probably a little better than an island. Cephalid Coliseum, kind of a cool card. If I have Threshold, I can force target player to draw 3 cards and then discard 3 cards. So a tiny little wheel effect that comes on a land, so why not? Spine Rock Knoll, one of the 2 good hideaway lands in this format. Obviously with my Megrim, I can easily deal 7 damage to a player in a turn, so I can get a free spell. Random Strip Mine to deal with lands, why not? And then Temple of the False God and Ancient Tomb. Really, really good cards because you're getting mana ramp attached to your land. That's all the colorless producing lands I'm willing to run because I'd rather just make sure that my spells are reliably cast. And then a small selection of basics just to make sure that I don't get completely hosed by Blood Moon. So playing this deck really is quite straightforward. First of all, casting the general is pretty optional. I only really do it when I have nothing better to do with 4 mana. Once she's out, she's pretty handy to have because she's just a thorn in people's side. She can trigger my discard hate effects, and, you know, discarding at random is really not nice to people, so why not? But basically, you're going to want to combine one of your wheel effects with one of your punishment effects. So you've got access to a lot of Wheel of Fortune effects. I think Memory Jar effects are the very best. You've got Windfall type effects and Wheel of Fortune type effects, as well as stuff like Shocker and Ill-Gotten Gains. So those are some creative ways. Like I said before, effects like these maximize the amount of cards that are discarded and drawn in one turn, so I think these are a little better than like Mind Twist. Plus they're more fun. But of course, don't feel afraid to run something like Myojin, which is just a straight up everyone discards their hand. Not very fun, but very effective. So the Punisher effects, you're going to want to run things that punish card drawing and card discarding. So Phyrexian Tyranny, Underworld Dreams, both very effective. Something like Psychosis Crawler, which triggers off of you drawing cards. Remember that you're drawing off of the Wheel of Fortunes as well, so something like that will work. Liliana's Caress and Megrim are obviously very crucial to the success of the deck. They're going to deal the most damage, so those are my prime tutor targets. Geth's Grimoire is just a backbreaking card, which, if it's out for just one wheel effect, is going to perfect my hand in one turn. Creatures like Abyssal Nocturnus will get the job done as well. And, you know, you're going to want to get creative with your Punisher effects, because there really aren't a ton of effects like that, like Liliana's Caress and Megrim, Underworld Dreams. You know, you don't have access to so many of those. So look for creative ways to synergize the wheel effects. So stuff like Guiltfeeder, obviously not a straight-up Punisher card, but you just know it's going to be very good in a deck filled with Windfall, Wheel of Fortune. Something like Words of War, obviously just not a Punisher effect by itself, but because you're drawing so many cards, it's just going to be effective in this deck. And then Wound Reflection. So none of these are straight-up Punisher cards that you could find in MTG Gatherer by searching, you know, whenever an opponent discards a card. But these are things you can sort of stumble across and think, hey, that kind of works well in this deck. I've only built this deck recently, so I'm probably missing some of the really cool cards that will synergize, like these 3, which I just sort of stumbled across. So if anyone has any ideas for Punisher-type cards that aren't, you know, intuitively obvious right off the bat, then let me know, because I'm probably missing something. And then being Grixis, you just have access to some really good utility. So tutors are really important in this deck because you need to have Megrim out, because you need to have Underworld Dreams out. Otherwise, you're just not going to have a very easy time dealing damage. And then you really just need to make some room for utility removal. Aftershock will help you deal with artifacts. Pongify is just really reliable. Cheap counterspells like Arcane Denial. And I'm a big fan of the Earthquake effects for sweepers because you can nuke your opponents with it as well. So that's my Gwendlyn Punisher deck. It's pretty fun to play. The style is really kind of explosive. It plays like a combo deck, like I said before. Basically, you just need to get one of your Punisher effects out with one of your wheel effects, and you're nuking players at the board really fast. The deck can be kind of fragile because if your key card gets nuked because people know just how good it is, then you're going to have a hard time pulling things off. That's why it helps to have some redundancy. Don't rely too heavily on Megrim. Try to find some creative ways to punish people, like Guiltfeeder is a good plan B, Niv-Mizzet, that kind of thing. So let me know if you try out this deck or if you have an existing one. Like I said, I only recently built this and I haven't been playing with it too much, so it's still kind of in testing, but I really like the list I have here. So let me know what you think. Do you have any good ideas to improve this, or some sleeper cards that I'm overlooking? So thanks for watching.